Keep going a bit longer. Oh, the applause that ends just as I get to the stage. That is perfect. Thank you. Hello. 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 You all right? Good. So I was, as you might have guessed from this, going to talk about space. Are we all space fans, Wired? Yes, as it is Wired, I've got to ask, anyone been? That's good. The tickets are a similar price. Oh, no. But no, they're not. I'll definitely be back next year. Space was something that I've always been interested in. I'm very lucky I get to make a show on Radio 4, as David mentioned, which is called It Is Rocket Science, all about the history and weird and wonderful possible future of space travel. And it's something, as I say, that I've been interested in ever since I was a kid. When I was very little, I was growing up in the 1980s, so I had pictures of the space shuttle on my wall, but I also was very, very interested from an early age in the Russian space program. And I'd like to say that was because I was interested in all things Russian, and I'd like to think that was because I was a very sophisticated 6-year-old who was already detecting flaws in capitalism and looking at the alternatives. But actually, it was because I grew up in a part of the northeast where Lada cars, those wonderful boxy Russian cars, were shipped across from Russia into Western Europe and refurbished and sold into the Western market. So when I saw Russia on the news, which was on the news a lot in the 1980s, it looked a bit like that. And when I looked out of my own window in the northeast, it looked a bit like that. So I sort of developed this early sort of sense of camaraderie and fascination with all things Russian, I think probably as a result. And I was kind of thinking about this because, as I say, the Russian idea of space is a wonderful exhibition. I don't know if you've been to see it, the Cosmonauts exhibition at the Science Museum. If you haven't already been, go. It's not now, but it's fantastic. It's shut, but it's fantastic. You must go and see it. It's wonderful. But I was thinking about that because I was thinking about, where my session's entitled "Where Do Ideas Come From?" So I wanted to talk really a little bit about how we get from this, which is a picture drawn in 1933 in Russia by a deaf school teacher. It shows astronauts floating freely in space, in a spacecraft. How we get from that to that, which is a picture on the International Space Station 2010, the cupola, actual astronauts floating next to a large window, and how we go possibly back in time and get to that, which is, you may recognise, a Stanford torus. It is the form of mass habitation in space that was studied at a NASA summer school in 1975. And I've been thinking a lot about them recently because I rewatched one of my favourite films in preparation for this. Have you seen the film Elysium? Science fiction film. It's a wonderful film. I recommend it if you haven't seen it. But the plot is basically, it involves a huge luxury habitation, a Stanford torus, very much like this one, that is floating above Earth, and it's the ultimate gated community. It's where all the elite live a couple of hundred years into the future, whereas everybody else is left on Earth and is having less of a fun time. That is a picture from the 1975 summer school, and that is a shot from Elysium. And I found this quite strange because I think this is the direction that sometimes it can feel like we're going with space, that rather than the idea that we might all end up living in space, there's an idea that maybe space is just for elite group of people. Maybe space isn't for everyone. Maybe it isn't somewhere that we're all going to end up. And I think certainly in the West, we see a lot of images that reinforce this. So we think of astronauts, we think of the wonderful bravery of people like Neil Armstrong returning to Earth, this wonderful ticker-tape parade, or we think of the first pay-as-you-go astronauts, as I like to think of them, the billionaires who went into space, Tito and Ansari. But we don't necessarily think of ordinary people going into space. But this, I would argue, is just because of the perspective that we're seeing, just because of the way things have panned out, didn't necessarily have to be like this. We think of, Elon Musk, who's here. This is a recent photograph. He's looking quite unhappy there. I'm assuming that's because he had to pay for those carrier bags. And they're not cheap. But again, we think of this idea that space belongs to billionaires. It doesn't belong to us all. It doesn't necessarily matter to us on an everyday basis. But I think that's, as I say, it doesn't have to be that way. And I was going to just give you, in order to get the sense of how we got to here, just a very quick rundown of the people who actually made it possible for us to go into space, and the very different perspectives and the very different options that their stories seem to offer us for the future. So these three guys, these are the three fathers of modern rocket science. All of them had one thing in common. They were all, in terms of where their ideas came from, they were all inspired by reading that they did as children and adolescents. And the one book that all three of them read, they all grew up at different times, different places in the world, but the one book that they all read was this book, From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. That is actually a rocket on the cover there. Some of you may be slightly confused by what appears to be a string and a sort of cardboard tube. But no, it's not what it looks like. It is a rocket on an early version of that book cover. They were all really inspired by this book. I don't know if you might not have read it. If you haven't read it, you can probably work out what happens from the title. That is the wonderful thing about Jules Verne. Never any twists. But yeah, so he wrote this book, and they were all three of them in their own way, I think, inspired by it. The first father of modern rocket science that I'm going to talk about is this guy, the Russian. He's the guy who made that drawing in 1933 of the astronauts. He's an incredible genius, incredible visionary. We're not really very well known at all in the West. I would argue that is a terrible, terrible oversight, because he is one of the most imaginative geniuses the world has ever seen. Evidence for that? Well, in 1903, Tsiolkovsky is sitting in his house, no electricity, outside Moscow, working by an oil lamp. And he's working out an equation. He's working out that the horizontal speed required for a minimal orbit around the Earth is 5 miles per second. And that could be achieved via a multi-stage rocket, rocket that comes apart higher up it gets, powered not by gunpowder, like previously people have imagined rockets would be powered by. No, powered by liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. This is 1903. You know, people say David Bowie was ahead of his time. Anyway, I'm a big fan of David Bowie, but I do think that calculation wheezes over the soundtrack to Labyrinth. But anyway, but you have to remember, 1903, so 1903, the Wright brothers are only just making the first tentative flights, and this guy is working out what it would take to get into space. It's an extraordinary vision, and it doesn't come from nowhere. He's very influenced. He's very influenced by a 19th century Russian thinker called Fedorov. Again, somebody we haven't really come across a huge amount in this country. Fedorov is what's called a cosmist, and he's very unusual, because in the 19th century, people were starting to see science as a threat to religion. People started to imagine that science was going to come along and erode all their cherished religious beliefs, erode the traditions that they'd held dear for so long. But the cosmists had a different idea. Fedorov imagined a future where science met religion halfway, where science basically enabled some of the prophecies in the Bible to come true. He was particularly interested in the idea of resurrection. He thought we shouldn't all sit around and wait for some supernatural being to come back and resurrect everybody. He believed that we should get on that ourselves. He believed that resurrection for everyone who'd ever lived was a real scientific possibility, and it was the main thing science should be working towards. And that led to the problem, though, because if you resurrect everybody who's ever lived, there is a bit of a space issue. Where do you put them all? So that's when he started to think, and influenced Tsiolkovsky to think, right, so if we colonised other planets, we could basically find a home for everybody, which is sort of, that's the sitcom possibilities of that are kind of amazing. Welcome back, Catherine the Great. You're revivified, and now you live on Pluto. It's me. So yes, it's an extraordinary vision. It's very hard to imagine now how such a fanciful vision could lead to such solid, concrete science that's enabled people. We still use Tsiolkovsky's rocket equation today when we're going into space, but that's where that particular idea came from something that would seem fanciful and far-fetched, even to transhumanists today, even to people, the billionaires, the people who want to, live forever in Silicon Valley. It's still kind of a strange idea. The second father of modern rocket science, anyway, is this guy. He is an American, and his name is Robert H. Goddard. And he offers a very different vision. In 1920s, he came along, he was very practical. Tsiolkovsky was largely theoretical, Goddard was practical, so in a very real sense, Tsiolkovsky was waiting for Goddard. He builds the first ever liquid fuel rocket. 1920s, he builds the first prototype rockets that could actually take off. He goes to the American press with this story, thinking that he'll be hailed as a hero. You'd imagine today America, a land of innovation, and that it encourages such ideas. A very different story in the 1920s. He is rubbished by the entire press. The New York Times, really, really scathing about him. They don't print a retraction of their article about him. This is in the 1920s. They don't print a retraction of it. until July 1969, when I think very much history has decided that Robert H. Goddard and his predictions for space travel and travel to the moon were very much right. It's a very bitter blow to him, because he's worked very hard to prove that space travel is a possibility. So he said he sort of thinks, I'm just going to leave. I'm just going to go away. I'm not going to stay in the city anymore. I'm just going to go and work somewhere very, very quiet. So he thinks, I don't know, he looks at a map. He thinks, I'm going to move to New Mexico. Hardly anyone lives there. Looks on a map, thinks, just pick a place at random in New Mexico. I know I'll move to Roswell. You've probably heard of Roswell, I'm assuming. Yeah, why have you heard of Roswell? Aliens, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Now, you see, no one has heard of Roswell because it's the place where Robert H. Goddard made all his rocketry breakthroughs. Everyone's heard of it because of the aliens. If you go to Roswell today, 2 museums. One to Robert H. Goddard's work, dusty, no one goes there. The other one to the alien crash landings, full of people dressed up, fancy dress. Yeah. It's a very sorry story. Fortunately, Robert H. Goddard died in the early 1940s, shortly before the Roswell landings. But when he did die, nobody made a film of his autopsy, starring Anton Deck, is all I'll say. Very difficult. So that was the second father of modern rocket science. The third father of modern rocket science. And this is the guy who I think has given us our view of how space travel goes in many, many ways. He was the one who had the most impact, the most influence on the way the story of space, the story of human beings travelling out into the cosmos has ultimately developed. He's a Transylvanian. His name is Herman Oberth. He is absolutely obsessed. He makes notes in the margin of From the Earth to the Moon about all the ways Jules Verne's got it wrong. He's obsessed with the idea of creating spacecraft. He devotes his life to it. He studies for a PhD in engineering. The great day dawns when he goes in to do his viva for his PhD. He's all enthusiastic, can't wait to get into the room. The people who are examining him, they're sort of sitting there, arms folded, judging, a bit more reticent, like some of you. They say to him, what's this, Oberth? What's this, your PhD that you've written about rocket travel, about how it's going to be possible for human beings to fly out into space in rockets? This, they say to him, is not a serious academic work. This is a fairy tale, they say to him. This is a utopian fantasy. Those are their exact words. Get out of here, go and write your PhD on something else. Bitter blow. It's a bitter blow. But what he does, how he reacts to this, I don't know if anyone here has ever been turned down for a PhD, but his reaction is quite extraordinary. His reaction changes the course of history, because what he doesn't listen to these people who've told him his dreams are nothing. He doesn't listen to people who've told him space travel will never happen. He does something absolutely extraordinary. He publishes his rejected PhD thesis himself. So 1920s in Germany, to everyone's surprise, to everyone's amazement, this rejected PhD thesis becomes almost overnight a bestseller. It's reprinted, it sells out, it's reprinted again, sells out, it starts being translated into different European languages all over Germany and all over Europe. A craze starts to happen in the 1920s. People start to imagine going into space. People start to make films about it. There's a wonderful film by Fritz Lang, I think, Frau im Mond, Woman in the Moon. It's a huge budget film at the time, which is one of the very early science fiction films, less famous, of course, than Metropolis now. They actually plan to do a rocket launch. It doesn't happen, but they plan to do a rocket launch for the premiere. And all over, as I say, particularly all over Germany, young people get really, really into the idea of starting up rocket clubs, starting up building these fantastic craft that might one day be able to be scaled up and take people into space. I've got a picture of some of those young people there in Germany. They don't actually look that young there. Well, age differently. But anyway, there they are, having the age-old length v girth debate. I do, well, that's funny. So yeah, they're building, they get very into this possibility. There are all kinds of possibilities out there in space. People get very excited about it. But of course, the 1920s turns into the 1930s all too quick, well, in the usual amount of time, turns into the 1930s. By 1933, the Nazis have extended their evil stranglehold across the whole of Germany. And because everybody's got very interested in the idea of space travel, because people have got very excited about the idea of building rockets, the Nazis realise, oh, right, so if you could build a rocket that would take a person all the way to the moon, you could also build a rocket that would take explosives to London. So that's what they start doing. They start putting a huge amount of time and effort and slave labour, we must never forget, from concentration camps into building rockets, into building machines of death, the super weapon, the like of which the world has never seen before. The first man-made object to go into space isn't a wonderful Russian spacecraft carrying floating people to look at the stars. It's a weapon of mass destruction. It's the forefather of nuclear weapons that showered over the 80s and gave us the Cold War. That's the first object that we, as the human race, send into space. It doesn't orbit the Earth. It's not the first object to orbit the Earth. It doesn't need to. It only goes up in Germany and lands on Germany's enemies. Terrifying, terrifying weapon. It was classified for a very long time. Governments, the Allied governments, did not tell their citizens what was happening. They didn't talk about this rocketry superweapon because they knew it would spread panic and terror everywhere. So it's kind of, I think, that's Herman Oberth's book cover. It's kind of, by rocket into interplanetary space, it's called. We look at it now, it doesn't look necessarily like a bestseller. It's quite hard to imagine the cultural impact that this book actually had. It's a slightly scary font as well. It's a little bit like the Daily Mail. But it doesn't feel, it's a self-published sensation that has a huge impact and changes the world forever. As I say, you don't necessarily get that from the cover. So I have redesigned it just so you get a sense of the popularity and impact of this book in the 1920s. So it has also, the book is, seriously, the book has a very big influence on a lot of people. One of them, probably the most famous rocket scientist still to this very day, which is slightly strange, which is this guy. You recognise him? Wernher von Braun, yes, exactly. Wernher von Braun here pictured in his office in NASA during the infamous glue on the desk episode. Some heads rolled after that. Kind of an extraordinary career, kind of a really, really bizarre career, Wernher von Braun. He starts out working for the SS during the war. He's building the V2s. He moves over to America in a very controversial operation, secret operation by the Americans to smuggle lots of Nazi scientists over to work on their space program called Operation Paperclip. I've never really known why they called it Operation Paperclip. I've always assumed maybe it was because when they were trying to hide the Nazi space scientists, a little animated figure popped up in the corner and said, "It looks like you're trying to spirit away some space Nazis. Can I help with that?" Anyway, I don't know. Soon everyone who remembers that paperclip will be dead and I won't be able to do that joke. But anyway, so he works as a children's television presenter for Disney before he even gets started on that. We've had some horrible revelations about children's television presenters in this country. That one is truly horrific. Then he starts working for NASA. Very odd CV, Wernher von Braun. But he's seen largely as the architect. He learns about space science from working for the Nazis, and he's seen largely as the architect of the Apollo program, which is quite a sort of worrying contradiction. But he's not the only person. He's not the only person responsible for the early days of NASA, so I'll rush through this. There's also another guy who Wernher von Braun credits himself. He was one of the early pioneers at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL. His name's Jack Parsons. I imagine NASA were always very pleased when they thought, "Oh, Jack Parsons, yeah, he's a good person to reference it. That's a good American name. He doesn't sound like a German. He doesn't sound like a Nazi." No, indeed, he's not. Jack Parsons, in his free time, was not interested in Nazism. He was instead interested in Satanism. There he is on the cover of one of his more Crowley. He's very influenced, I should not necessarily say Satanism. Crowley, he's very influenced by Aleister Crowley. And there he is in one of his books. Two very important things I should tell you about him before we end. The first is that he completely revolutionised rocket fuel, solid rocket fuel, by thinking to use a chemical no one had ever used before, potassium chlorate. That's the first thing. Second thing is, I would. Anyway, look at him, sexing up that book cover. This is years before Brian Cox. Oh, anyway, yes, we'll move on. Just to sum up this bit very quickly about where do ideas come from? Well, United States space program at this crucial intersection here of the Venn diagram. Slightly familiar also as a plot device in Raiders from the Lost Ark. It's good. Anyway, I am overrunning, so I better hurry up quickly. So I think this is one of the roots. This fascinates me. As soon as you remove ideas from Earth's gravity, as soon as you start thinking about the Earth, as soon as you start thinking about the universe, it's a very extraordinary thing. Ideas become weightless. There's a sort of levity to things. There's a sort of playfulness. There's a strangeness that comes into play as soon as we start thinking about the history of the universe. The universe doesn't have to, we don't have to carry on in terms of space travel in the way that we have done. Space can be for everybody. We think of this quest for immortality, we think of the quest to go into space as something we associate now with Silicon Valley billionaires, but all the roots of those ideas we can trace back to 19th century Russia and a dream for everybody, not just everybody alive today, but everybody who has ever lived. Oh, also, bonus. Yeah. Very good. Sorry. We think it doesn't have to, as I say, it doesn't have to be that way. We can all potentially get on the immortality bus if we listen to the Russian cosmists. We can all, America, we think of, as I say, we think of, where people are going to be going. We think of space colonies. We think they could be full of rich people, but also what may well happen in our world is that space colonies will be full of stateless people, people who are being persecuted for their religion, people who have strange and unusual ideas, and we all know where that leads, of course. That would be, yes, it leads to America. Anyway, that is the end of my talk. Oh, gosh, yes, these slides are very interesting. That is the end of my talk. I have everyone, sorry about that. Thank you very much, and good night. Yeah.